Before we get into a closing debate and start throwing cupcakes at each other, I think Martin Vesely would like to say a few words to us.
Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Martin Vesely. I'm Dalibor's nephew, and I'd like to speak on behalf of the family. It's very humbling to see so many people give up their Monday to attend a conference in memory of my uncle Dalibor and to share his legacy. I'd also like to thank Wendy, Peter, and Eric for putting this conference together. I know how much hard work that involves, and it's been a lovely day. And also thank you to Emmanuel College and the School of Architecture at Cambridge for hosting today. Dalibor was a very close member of our family. We were quite a small group, and we left Czechoslovakia more or less at the same time, and we were immigrants in Britain, living quite closely together, and Dalibor was a regular visitor to our family, and we miss him greatly. In some way, he ruined my life.
No idea what you're talking about.
His visits would often start on a Saturday for dinner, and debate would start before dinner. It would go on after dinner. It would go on into the early hours. If we were lucky, it would be broken by some sleep, and it would then start again on Sunday, and would continue till Sunday evening. I was very fortunate as a child to be part of those debates and to be welcomed into them. I didn't have much to contribute. Debate is perhaps the wrong word, as the dialogue was one way. However, the real challenge for me was on Monday when I had to return to school. I had spent the weekend discussing the finer details of Romanesque portals in the Pyrenees, or the difference between Riemenschneider and Weitstoss. When I wanted to share these newfound details with my fellow pupils, whose only interest was in whether Chelsea would be relegated or not, I found it difficult to make friends. However, very much like a fine wine, the various components gradually come into harmony with the passage of time. And it's those years of suffering that have given me the legacy that I have now. I'm not in the field of architecture or history of art, but I feel that I have a very good grounding in those areas, thanks to Dalibor. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to say the Vesely family is very advanced students when it comes to art and architecture in Europe. I traveled back across Europe with Drahosh, and I learned more about Madonnas on that trip than I ever had before. We thought, rather than try to cover everything, that we'd sort of raise a couple of themes and see if we run out of those, we got more. And see if they aren't sort of close enough to get a kind of, semi-concluding discussion. I mean, this, as Wendy and Eric both say, this is unconcludable. History's sort of like that. But we thought there were two areas that kept coming up. One was city making, and particularly this idea of collaboration, friction, of what a topography does as a kind of communicative order. And, is it something that you can only do in a studio? Is it something, it obviously has a reality as a kind of symbolic topography. The conversations I've had with people over the years since about how this happens, who's empowered, under what conditions, make it look like all the themes are there, and without having done it as an architectural project, I don't think you'd have a sense of the themes. And I think this is what William was hinting at earlier. Where'd William go? There he is, right. Okay, so that's one issue. And the other is this, the problem of poetics and what we mean by that, and particularly the poetics of metamorphosis, the mimesis of typical situations, and how those two communicate with each other. Problem of fragment is obviously embedded in that. Comments, questions? I have to say, while you're all thinking, that I've been immensely stimulated by the presentations today. I mean, I've got lots of notes, and my head is full of, oh yes, there we go, that's on. And how the diversity, what I called in my written piece, something like the extraordinary company of people who've been inspired by Dalibor, and have gone out and built things, written things, kids, families, going away, come back. How something like the culture, there's a kind of deep intuitive dimension at which it's still possible to talk about these things and get going very quickly in a conversation, even if it's much harder to actually, when Rowan says the city is in trouble, this is what John Burrell was saying, there is, and at the same time that there are people who do understand much better than certainly the early days, yet because of the way economics works, because of the way councils work, it's possible for the one-liner idiot to be more successful than the person who says, oh no, it's really about, a whole culture, it's really about a whole neighborhood. Those are by far the more difficult arguments to carry, both verbally and politically. What lies between the mob and simply gazing up at the, fantastic form that's been dropped at the end of the block. Or as one of my students is working on the Latino market in Tottenham Hale, the developer wants to just wipe it out and fill it with, generic shops, which is claimed to be mixed use. And it's clearly, it's more use than mixed, shall we say. And, how to make a city that has the richness, violence, smells, or somebody used the word visceral, I think it was Carolyn, of the metropolis under the conditions that we now live. Anybody who's gone to Hong Kong can see the conflict very visibly. Okay. Carolyn.
I'm doing a lot of talking, but just to get the ball rolling, as it were.
We're definitely into rolling balls.
Exactly. I think one of the problems is that, there's several problems. Here we go. But I think one of them is that the complexity that Dalibor hints at and makes available, as it were, is something that one embraces and intuitively feels. And yet, it's one of those things that doesn't get described in 3 sentences. And this translates up into a bigger problem in general, which is that silver bullet thinking, and I think we live in a world now where people are looking for something they can tweet, and really Dalibor's world is more about just let the thing be, and it will slowly emerge. But if you're, to sort of answer the question that you put earlier on, Peter, if you're an architect kind of competing to build a project in King's Cross, say, as well as I do that the kinds of discussions that are going to get had and the kinds of sort of, debates that are going to be made available in the 5 minutes for the decision to be made are going to lean hugely towards something that presents itself as a sort of one-size-fits-all, very grabbable, silver bullet solution type thing. And so for me, I mean, one of the permissions, I think, that Dalibor gave us, but it's also a challenge, is that we have to hold out for the not obvious. We have to hold out for the not graspable in a moment, without being obscure, though. And I think this is something else. This is, I come back again to the power of the word I can't say, paradigmatic situation. There's a sort of a graspable simplicity to that, within which all the complexity resides. And I remember when I was a student, there would always be, oh God, you Cambridge lot, you use all those long words and you do all those fuzzy drawings. And there was a kind of resentment almost to the sort of this apparently cabalistic world that the school seemed to be from the outside, perhaps to some people. I think maybe it was threatening because people were actually designing buildings, which was quite radical at that time in any architecture school. And of course, much harder to do than just mapping computer, grids or whatever else. But secondly, because it refused to be pinned down. And that in itself is threatening. So in a sense, we have to find a way of defending the complex, defending the open-ended, defending the rich, defending the paradoxical, without seeming like a weird cabalistic set of monks.
Or seeming like Venturi, where it just becomes kind of iconographic play.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think Dalibor's intuition right from the beginning was that practice is where that would happily reside. And as we've seen today, I mean, with the sort of diaspora of people who are practicing Daliborism, the whole kind of lexicon of Dalibor-related terms. You begin to see how that sort of richness can be included without sort of being, up itself or all about, moth breeding factories or whatever.
Yeah, I think the big difference is between the conceptual generalizations, which, space being the killer of all killers in this respect, and the way we were constantly being told that it grows out of the concrete. That's where the simplicity and the richness come from simultaneously, is out of understanding that phenomenon. And for some reason, people are much happier with the concepts. It sort of, gives you a power over all that difficulty. Yeah.
I think what you said, Peter, earlier about the adaptability of a simple terrace house is interesting. And it seems to me that in the contemporary city, one of the things that has been lost is that definition of front and back that was so clearly part of Dalibor's urban block and your urban block understanding. And I think complexity can come about through changeability or the capability of changing the building fabric. And modern buildings simply, with steel frames and cladding that wraps around on all four sides, is terribly difficult to change. There's very little capacity for flex and for metamorphosis to happen, so that culture can take its effect over a long period of time. So things like, I've been very interested in the Victorian brick industrial building. The fact that it's got flex in its section to allow it to serve through different uses over its life. The Victorian or the Georgian terrace, is absolutely another example of that, where the back is capable of being very, very fluid. So the city can ebb and flow and metamorphose easily. Yeah,
I think the business of, I always have this standard line that an urban order has to be strong enough to take bad architecture. And I think the thing that Dave talks about, I don't know if you talked about it today, but you do in your piece, when you were talking about the visible and invisible, how you walk down a street and it's not simply what you see that's happening. It's a much wider culture to which you adapt. You know, it's gestures, postures, food. You're absolutely right. And the business of being able to develop that background is where the problem lies, because if all it is kind of 9-meter bays and glass, all of that is made explicit and shallow and superficial. Rowan, you.
I just want to pick up on a word you used just now, which was conflict. And so we sit here now and we can see things that are very obviously wrong with the way that cities are being built. We would also have sat in a space like this 30 years ago and said the same thing, but with slightly different altered forms. So from which you might think, and I do think that, you know, the problem is never solved, that there's always a kind of ongoing struggle between what we might aspire to, the kind of good things we've been talking about, and what actually happens. And for me, with Dalibor's teaching, there was always an area of it which I don't quite know what the answer to it is, but it's about this question: was it ever sorted? Because as a way of understanding what Dalibor said, is there was a time of wholeness. You know, there was the Baroque, and then it fell to pieces, and now we've got to kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
The Baroque is broken.
The Baroque is broken, thank you. And I was always a bit mistrustful of that, because it seemed like a simplification. And I was struck, again, by something William said, I think it was William, when he quoted Kundera talking about the Baroque as an invading army, kind of almost like Soviet tanks, yeah? So this is like an open question, but I'm struck by the way the Baroque was so important to Dalibor, but it was also something in a Czech context that is definitely ambiguous, and its goodness is very, very ambiguous indeed. And also, if you look more widely at the late Baroque, I would say there's an element of sort of anxiety about it. It's created by conservative regimes who are aware that they're being challenged, and therefore they have to kind of state wholeness more emphatically than ever. So I just put it out there. Did Dalibor think there really was ever a time? I'm sorry, if you had been sitting there in the early 18th century, you sure as hell wouldn't have felt that everything was sorted, and you would have felt there were crises and challenges and threats. So my question is, did Dalibor himself ever really think there was a golden age when everything was kind of right, or not?
Very briefly. So, my feeling about this was that he didn't advocate that there was that the Baroque was a golden age, but simply that streets built in the Baroque period are, you know, by and large good streets. Of course, they're obsolete in many ways now that we have motor cars, and so that was my reading of it. So it wasn't a simplistic kind of embracing of all things Baroque, but the fact remains that.
Yes, but it was also a bit more than good streets, wasn't it? I mean, Dalibor had incredibly detailed investigations of Baroque churches and of how they worked iconographically and spatially and so on.
Can I just say one thing? I think the whole point of the Baroque was that there was a tension, and the tension was what really gave it the richness. And so that things were always on the verge of flying out of control, and yet at the same time there was a very strong sense of what the culture was and so on. And that's what was good about it. And I seem to remember Dalibor talking about it in those terms. I mean, I really worry a little bit about using the words wholeness and totality and so on. I don't think that was part of what Dalibor was advocating. Maybe in heaven, but not on earth. That there would never be that kind of wholeness. Yeah, but at the same time, there was that sense that we could aspire to something like that. But that it wasn't really ever going to exist here. And the Baroque was wonderful, not because of some great totality of it, but because through the tension, it encompassed so many different things.
There's it's coming over your left shoulder.
I think the understanding of the Baroque is sort of shorthand for something that I think in the Cromwellian context of Cambridge is probably difficult for some people to deal with. But I think you're right, Wendy. The Baroque is not a symbol of wholeness for Dalibor at all. It's he spoke about there being a series of renaissances in culture for which architecture had a role to play, beginning with the Periclean age of the establishment of democracy, the building of theatres, the building of the agora. The whole agonic situation of city making was always one of conflict. He talks about the Norman Empire, the effect of trade, the rediscovery of classical texts and geometry and mathematics from what was by then the Arabic world, the Islamic world, and then the Renaissance as another period of rediscovery of the depths of human culture, which architecture and the other arts have a role in manifesting, spatializing, embodying and articulating. And then there's the 20th century, which is this terrible period of conflict, of which architecture is I think the modernist project is slightly misunderstood today as one where things could be resolved. And I think that's why Dalibor certainly wouldn't claim there's any golden age for being an architect. There's certain points where what's at stake is more visible and more and that there are certain conversations going on. And I think that was what he was attempting to resuscitate, was a dialogue about the fractured, broken nature of taxonomy, for want of a better word, of epistemology, of philosophy, and of dialogue, that it's not something that deals with absolutes or nostalgia, but it, by its very nature is something which, human culture, which resists nostalgia and which resists projective utopian thinking. That's why I think that, he refers to it as a period of divided representation, but he also talks about the role of creativity in this. And with regard to Eric's work, he wants to talk, I think he wrote about it, described it as a grey area of modernity, where within, we know in our own discipline, especially the kind of the overriding pedagogic theoretical discipline of architecture of Peter Eisenman et al. Is a kind of formalist, systematic understanding of composition as an autonomous activity, on the one hand, or there's, as Wendy alluded to this morning, the tendency to kind of drift into sociology as if that, kind of universal panacea that can solve the fundamental dilemma of creativity. To answer Peter's question earlier, it was a question about time and how one deals with development situation. What one tends to find is there are actually some articulate voices for block structures in cities, local residence groups. Since the foundation of the Victorian Society, etc., forces that we think of as, on the one hand, conservative, i.e., heritage, are actually local residence groups in another guise. And the fundamental role of the architect, I believe, is to engage in dialogue and negotiation with these forces and attempt to find a point at which the desire to make money and the desire to make something which is beautiful can reach a point of virtuous behaviour. certainly that was Alberti's exhortation to his patrons. Was if you want praise, you need to be virtuous. And I think that doesn't really go away. It's kind of what an architect does. Is they don't operate in a utopian situation, nor do they operate one with a projective fantasy. Obviously, this is incredibly difficult to mimic in a school of architecture because you have real-life conflicts and real-life protagonists. But I think there's a kind of, as Peter keeps reminding us via Dalibor's interpretation of Aristotle's Poetics, that praxis is the mimesis of praxis. It's acting out justice. It's doing something in the best way possible to you at a certain point. I don't think it deals with absolutes or some nostalgia for a golden period, therefore.
My question will be a bit longer than that one. The Baroque, it wasn't tanks, was it? But it was sort of gilded angels and cherubim. It was an invasion, and it was the style of the Counter-Reformation, and the Baroque marked out the territory of the Roman Catholic Church, and all that entailed. So it was sort of ideological, and I suppose it strikes me that in this conversation, where metaphor and poetics have been referred to throughout the day without any more clarification than at the beginning, that is poetics the equivalent to the Counter-Reformation in this case?
There was somebody over here, I think. No? Yes. Nick. And then over here.
Yeah.
Oh. It sounded so much like a statement to me. the literal. No, you're absolutely right.
Is that a similar impulse to a sort of Counter-Reformation impulse? Is it the invisible that the architecture attempts to make visible as explicitly from the Council of Trent?
There are the occasional believers who think that, but I think most of us are. I mean, it would be very difficult to go through a history of poetics in the afternoon without sending you all screaming into the. But it's one of those really difficult words. I didn't actually. We're dealing with the relation between philosophy and poetry, the problem of analogy, the question of metamorphosis. Okay, fine. Metamorphosis of what? A caterpillar into a butterfly? We're dealing with situations. I mean, the example I always go through in any discussion between type and typicality is where the type bedroom gives you a bed, a kind of window, a closet, a side table, and maybe a nearby loo, and probably fitted carpet. Whereas sleep, dream, sex, illness, death, all of those themes in which a bedroom invokes are, much, much deeper and aren't immediately solved by the type. One of the examples I gave is the bed at the top of Villa Chaudin. You know that? It's got a canopy and there's a kind of roofscape with a water tank and an oculus. And this bed is dropped into this, and in those countries you sleep on the roof a lot. But what Le Corbusier's done is bring it into his whole horizontal landscape motif, and it becomes, a completely different kind of bed. It's actually a very hard bed. But, to be able to think analogically in that way, you keep the bed, but it's become something, you can also use it to play ping pong on if you want, or just to sit on. but it's got this bed situated in this upper landscape under these horizons, right by that river and so forth. Suddenly becomes a very different bed. It's not just the kind of thing you can fit out with IKEA furniture or, one of those. David Lynch's Twin Peaks does a really interesting thing with this problem. It basically what it did was it went through middle American market categories from lower middle class to just above upper middle class and looked at what kind of houses they lived in, what kind of furniture they had, what they had on their mantelpieces, what they hung in their walls, and developed this kind of semiotics of potential references, and then just turned it over to other directors, including himself, and allowed, figured out who all the people in that are kind of like models for what they represent. They're slightly too pretty, or they're slightly too ugly, or slightly too strange. And the basic thing about how beautiful the Pacific Northwest was, all that nature was turned into its opposite. That's where the aliens came from. That's where the drugs happened. That's where the prostitutes were. That's where, Bob came from. And, and he showed up in your bedroom and blah. But, that's what's meant by thinking situationally. It's something that, that can only, the idea that you're showing that in a middle-class living room at prime time is the kind of situation out of which all of that grows. The sofa that I'm sitting on is all of a sudden enchanted or cursed. What the Baroque allows one to see, and actually that's, as I say, it's all plaster. And the tendency is just to look at the Baroque churches. When you look at the whole Baroque town, you're in a very different world. And I think one of the things that Dalibor mentions probably too quickly in his treatment of Zwiefalten is the way it's embedded in the cycles of the seasons, the way, it's part to do with crops. It's also, of course, to do with the Christian year and so forth. And when, I think it was Wendy was trying to work back and forth between David Leatherbarrow and Christianity, there simply is a question, how much Christianity is in surrealism? There's plenty. How much is in alchemy? There's plenty. And does that mean you lose it? Should the great chain of being be something explicit or much more implicit? And that's where analogy, metamorphosis, and the funny condition of getting it, knowing when you haven't embarrassed yourself with your analogies or haven't been superficial or just sort of jokey like Tafuri, but, Venturi. But this is why everybody likes Venturi's mother's house over, the ironic column or something like that. The mother's house seemed to touch on an American house, make it strange, thereby making it more familiar. And that's the kind of interpretation, that's probably, Gadamer kept saying you can only play small organs in our culture. You can't do a Baroque church. And Dalibor never set a sacred project, with the possible exception of the cemetery in the 78 AA studio. It was always working with the potential depth of the stuff we always already do. I don't know if that is an answer to a question.
But it's interesting, Fred, because, just reflecting, you were the studio next door almost, at the AA. Yeah, across the corridor.
That's what those distinctions matter.
And, I think actually, yes, after the cemetery, one thinks of the work of DIP Unit 1 and the way it would reveal, I think those first projects really were very powerful in terms of unleashing a kind of creative spirit after many people, there's a lot going on in the AA, very interesting. I think we were talking at lunchtime, Calliope and I, about, it's not just DIP Unit 1 that was doing beautiful drawings. There's an array of amazing representation going on, and there's a learning from each other. But I think the thing that was very specific to Dalibor, picking on that, and I've got one or two other kind of observations, was the way in which I would remember a student who would unlock a kind of a small apartment in a way that was just completely novel, actually, at that point. There were insights into the use of mundane, everyday space that were quite startlingly different to the very rational world of certain schools at that point. So I think the word poetic is absolutely reasonable and metaphor as well for those initial studies, and some of the way in which the simple things that Rowan was talking about, like the cafe, could be explored and new territory could be found, which was really very startling. I'm struggling to think. Is Mehrabani, remind me, Calliope. Kaveh Mehrabani, a fantastic apartment section, that lives with me today very vividly, and many, many others. So those intense explorations, I think, really did raise the everyday to a new kind of level of observation. Actually, if I could just go back to beyond the Baroque, and I think for the Baroque, because Dalibor, personally, opened my eyes to many things, and we've shared many of those today. City structure, the world of the Rococo, beyond the Baroque, which is a phenomenal world, and a very collaborative world, a material world that was explored, and the question of light, and the way light is used there, which Dagmar, I think, shone some very nice perceptions on in terms of Dalibor's own flat, actually. But I think the complexity and the three-dimensional character of some of those spaces, whilst not readily transferable, still have extraordinary lessons. So, as Patrick was saying, the grey zone of modernity, with which I don't think you could get any closer to that than Stockley Park, actually. Phil and I, endured the terror of the developers in that absolutely absent world in terms of cultural ground, and to kind of make something in that still drew on all those lessons of amazing field trips. Something still rocks, in terms of the way light can be drawn into a space and so on. So I think it's not directly transferable, but I don't think you can actually deal with the grey zone of modernity unless you've had that extraordinary diet of richness. It's not that you can't deal with it, but it kind of creates a resilience, which is a rather overused word now, but in design terms, when you're faced with banality, to have that background to be able to play the game with in terms of too many notes and how you reduce them to a world that's kind of acceptable is very, very key. I'm still puzzled, I have to say. I think that the poetic also is absolutely clear in terms of the way that Dalibor started to construct city spaces and the urban block, which has obviously been key. And if you fly over London, you see Metroland, essentially. And I do think we're really faced by some extraordinary questions that are very real. The issue of forum, of communicative space, urban space, really can give us lessons in terms of application. So that infrastructure means that Metroland is now challenged, as the estates are. And there's a real job to be done out there to kind of make sense of what at the moment is just a very dislocated sort of response to opportunity. So whilst London and Metroland is a world of, as Rasmussen kind of pointed out, of front doors, England is very different to the European city. It's how we actually create a territory of terraces or things that are joined up is still, I think, something we're struggling with, London and England and beyond probably. Because we just don't have that culture of apartment living and the question of mixed use and use is still in the air, and nobody's quite grasped it politically, because the opportunity is there to, I think, make an extraordinary kind of contribution to these denser knuckles of actually the sort of territories like Kentish Town. I mean, that are still there as open wounds that could be worked on in a very, very interesting way. So I think there's a curious alliance, actually, between Roger's thinking about densification, and Dalibor. And I think he looked at Dalibor's work in the studio and learnt a lot from it, and took it to the mayoral level. So somehow there's a sort of difficulty with the European urban bloc and how it gets transferred culturally to just simple, banal things about how communities take charge of a building, an apartment building, which we don't really know. And I guess that sort of responds to projects I remember that were going on in your studio, like the building of endless rooms and so on. It's this question of actually how you create an order that will respond and allow a communicative condition to evolve.
There was Dave? No?
I think Nick had a...
Oh, right, Nick, sorry, yes. There was Nick and then Mark.
Okay. Sorry, I'm Nick Temple, Professor of Architecture at Huddersfield, University of Huddersfield. I've got just a kind of response or a kind of inquiry, a query really, in response to the context of the role of the architect in city making. And this is specific about a conference that I organised when I was teaching at University of Lincoln quite a few years ago, in which Dalibor gave a paper, and it was actually on the relationship between architecture and the humanities. And Dalibor gave a paper called Architecture as a Humanistic Discipline. And it provoked a lot of debate about what constitutes a humanistic discipline in the age of technology. What is humanism in the age of technology? How do we understand it in terms of the dramatic changes that have taken place within the discipline of architecture, but also within the very nature of a humanistic historical context? And what made me think, actually, after the conference and the publication, was actually Dalibor's, and I have no answer to this because I've never asked him, but Dalibor's understanding of humanism in the context of Ernesto Grassi's interpretation of humanism, particularly after the Second World War, the dispute that he actually had with Heidegger and the letter to humanism, and a number of publications that came out after the Second World War. And I know that Dalibor was actually influenced by Grassi, but I have no idea whether his particular position on the humanistic discipline through a context of the discipline of architecture was partly influenced by the debates or the kind of relationships between Grassi and his dispute with, quite well-known dispute with Heidegger. And that's just a question.
Yeah, to me, the real miracle of humanism, it has nothing to do with it becoming a discipline, which it did after it was humanism, but how it grew out of basically intercity warfare, and how you who is it that transforms intercity warfare into humanism? I mean, it's a 400-year problem, but that's kind of we're in a similar problem, but we have the opposite difficulty. Everything works for us. It's a problem of apathy, not of danger. Or, I'm sorry, one-word answer. But sorry, who? Yeah.
Sorry, I was making notes. So I don't know whether this is a sequitur, but I'm just thinking of this issue of the and the modern situation and communicative space, and it seems to me that there is an apparatus in place in the modern world, which is to do with broadcast media, social media, what have you, that is concretely unsituated. And of course, in the Baroque time, architecture carried that. I wonder if I just sort of open it to the panel really for their observations on that sort of current situation really.
Well, this was Moneo's point where we started, and the idea that architecture, either you have one of two hypotheses. One, Moneo presumes that there's a kind of absolute bucket of representational water that you can use to orient yourself in being. Or, as Gadamer argues, it's a problem of attenuation. I mean, if you take something like the cell phone, it's terribly sophisticated how the message is delivered, but once you've got it, it's completely primitive. You know, it could be a clay tablet. It just happens to move faster. You know, it's basically a form of dialogue with which we're very familiar. And I think unpicking, I think the degree to which architecture, the more primitive dimensions of existence, allow the more sophisticated ones to have meaning is part of the answer to that. I mean, if you imagine a table full of experts, you know, acoustics, economics, structure, so on and so forth, they're all impotent until you decide that it's an airport or a library and it's got a kind of decorum and it's situated somewhere. I mean, all that primitive stuff is what allows these other guys with their expertise to have, I mean, this is part of the problem of embodiment and articulation we were talking about earlier. But I don't, I mean, Moneo kind of half-asked the question. I think what somebody else brought up of architectural period, I think it was Patrick, periods in which architecture was important. It's also possible to be neurotic about this. I mean, if you think about the Romans, I mean, they're hanging on to life through their architecture. I think it's one of the reasons that it's so inventive. And it's almost indecent. I mean, some of it is so massive and sophisticated. And I think that's a very open problem, but I think in the fascination with the new, I mean, this is again something Dalibor kept saying over and over again, it's terribly easy to forget what's always already there. What you know, we've always talked face to face, we sleep, we eat. An immense amount of life has been going on forever, just in sort of different clothes. At the same time, it's also possible for these, you know, the reason we start gravitating around humble stuff is because so much of it is sophisticated, and that is disorienting. I mean, there's no question that it's got a disorienting power, and it's like the problem of, okay, taxonomies have a use, but where? What kind of, you know, how is that part of a larger, more rich world?
I think just to perhaps put it very simply, but reminiscing over something that Dalibor used to bring to his MPhil seminar every year. And he'd tell everybody about the astronauts. The astronauts would go up into space, but what would they look at? Well, they'd look back at Earth. And I think that says rather a lot.
Yeah, I was involved with the design of the LEM. And at the beginning, it was a riot. The engineers were so clever, you know, it's weightless. You can put anything anywhere. And they were doing things like making the instrument panel to escape Earth's gravity out of biscuit so that you could eat it. And you just drop the instruments in some sort of thing and dump them. And, you know, it just didn't work. It drove everybody nuts. They need a down and an up. I mean, there's a famous New Yorker article that goes through all of this. I'm sorry. Okay, I think I smell wine. And where is wine happening?
It's in the old library.
Old library, okay. Well, thank you all very, very much. This has really been, as I say, I've come away with I've got 10% left of my battery, but I've got an absolutely full hard drive. Thank you very, very much.